Hi, I'm Bill Roach, the chair of the Environment Committee, and Jack Carr, who is the chair of the Let's Talk Science Committee, has just told me how to use my mic. So thank you, Jack. Thank you all this morning for coming on a lovely day, and I think this will be an interesting talk. This is the fourth in a series that we've had about water quality in Puget Sound, and we've had a wonderful group to work with in the King County Science and thank you, Water and Land Resources Division. And you may have seen the paper this morning had a very interesting article on beavers, and this is the same group that has done that research is doing the group that Dr. Martin is a part of. And the series has been jointly sponsored, as I mentioned, by the Let's Talk Science and the Environment Committee. And Dr. Martin is a Bellevue native, has been a water quality planner with King County's Water and Land Resources Division since May of 2020, a tough time to come to work. Her work revolves around managing and leveraging long-term monitoring programs in Puget Sound with a particular eye towards ocean acidification and nutrients. Dr. Martin received a PhD in environmental earth science, system science at Stanford, and I'm told that's oceanography, in other words. And so let's welcome Dr. Taylor. Dr. Martin.
Okay, I'm on now. I'm going to do my best to actually talk into the microphone, but please do wave and let me know if you cannot hear me while I am talking. Okay. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, or not quite afternoon. I'm glad that you're all in here in this air-conditioned room with me, even though it is a lovely day outside. Today, I'm going to talk to you about long-term monitoring in Central Puget Sound, diving into past and present water quality. The plan. This is the plan for my talk. I'm going to talk about our King County marine monitoring programs just a little bit, mostly the who, what, where, when, why, and how we are doing this work. I'm going to talk to you about some multi-year trends that we've seen with some of this data that we've been collecting over the past several decades. I'm going to proselytize about the importance and utility of our data sets, all publicly available, which is pretty sweet, as one of the biggest pros of working for the government is that you get to share your data with everybody, which is really lovely. I'm going to talk to you about some cool stories from the past, just a little bit, and then I'm going to dig into some of the current work that I'm doing, which focuses mostly on nutrients in Puget Sound. So these are things like nitrogen, phosphorus, silica. But today I'll be talking mostly about nitrogen, which is near and dear to my heart because that is what I did my PhD work on, nitrogen and oxygen isotopes in the global oceans. So I'm going to talk about some of the ongoing work on nutrients, quantifying wastewater impacts and how we do that, and then some of the ongoing research that is related to the work. Okay, so these are the four main pillars of our marine monitoring in Puget Sound. We focus on water quality, so this is measuring offshore, so in the deeper parts of Puget Sound, but also the beach. These are things like temperature, salinity, oxygen, bacteria, particularly at the beaches in Puget Sound. You might want to know how many fecal coliform bacteria are there. We also measure phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are the little photosynthesizing critters at the top of the water, and so we measure both how many are there and also what is there. Different types of phytoplankton have different outcomes for the ecosystem, so we do care about how many and who are there. We measure the sediment, so we measure, again, both offshore and beach. We look at the chemistry in the sediments as well as what sort of organisms are living there. Chemistry is particularly relevant in the sediments because things tend to accumulate there over a long period of time, which is very different from the water column where things are a little more ephemeral. Things don't stick around. Things change pretty quickly. Residence time for water in Puget Sound is less than a year, more or less, so things don't stay, but they sure do in the sediments. So things like metals from, maybe some less scrupulous industrial activity in the greater Seattle area finds its way into the sediments, where it mostly just stays there. And we can measure that over time to see how things are getting better, which is true. This is not the subject of my talk today, but you should know that the sediments are getting better over time, which is great news. And then finally, we also measure zooplankton, which is our attempt to sort of gather more information about the marine food web writ large. We're not looking at fish, we're not looking at orca, but we are measuring the very small things that maybe some other groups are not. So we are looking at zooplankton, which are the next step up, trophically speaking, from phytoplankton. So zooplankton, little microscopic critters, tend to eat things like phytoplankton or other particles that are floating through the water. So in order for us to know how the fish might be thriving or not, we also need to know what they might be eating, which are the zooplankton. Okay, so I'm going to focus today mostly on the water quality component and less on the other things, but you're free to ask me questions later about the other aspects of our programs. Okay, here is a lovely map. We are here somewhere. Great. We have a couple of different types of things that we measure at each of these stations. You'll note that there are symbols which correspond to the types of data that are collected at each of these locations, with the purple circles being water samples. That is what we take the most of. We take the most water samples because they give us the most information for the least amount of money. Phytoplankton and zooplankton sampling is much more expensive, so we do that at fewer places. There are a couple of key stations here that I want to point out that I'm going to talk about throughout this talk. One is Point Jefferson, which is this station up here. This is sort of our flagship station. We collect water, phytoplankton, and zooplankton samples there, and we have collected data here on and off since the 70s and even before. So a lot of data collection happening here. The other place I'm going to talk about is Quartermaster Harbor, which is down here on Vashon Island, between Vashon and Maury Islands, right in the inner harbor. This is a place that is particularly interesting to me because it is the place in Puget Sound, or in Central Puget Sound, where dissolved oxygen gets lowest, which I will get into in a little bit. The data collection happens not through my capable hands, but instead our field science unit. They collect all these samples. They go out twice a month throughout most of the year, so February through November, which is the bulk of the growing season for things like phytoplankton in Puget Sound. And this is a really special program because it's really unusual for a county to be able to do this kind of science at this kind of scale. It's expensive, and usually this sort of sampling would be undertaken at a state or perhaps even a federal level. But we have a lot of invested interest in making sure that Puget Sound and Central Puget Sound, King County waters, are clean and healthy for the organisms and ourselves. Or I guess we are organisms. The organisms other than ourselves and also ourselves. Also note that we have some stations in the Duwamish River, and you might be wondering, are these truly marine sites? I am an oceanographer. I work in marine systems. The Duwamish stations provide a lot of really interesting and important data for water quality models, which I will get into later. Generally speaking, the design of our sampling program in its sort of inception was to compare and contrast between locations that are close to wastewater treatment plant outfalls, circled in orange, and the wet weather treatment plants circled in blue, and some more ambient stations that are further away from these outfalls. So one of the main goals of this program is to compare, is water quality different at an outfall compared to not an outfall? But there are also some other things that we care about when we are thinking about why we monitor Puget Sound, or something that I get asked from time to time by my inquisitive family members who help pay my salary through their tax dollars. Why does King County have oceanographers at all? Well, we need to characterize water quality and food web conditions for things like salmon, organisms other than ourselves and ourselves. We also want to evaluate trends, both within the context of global climate change as well as regional changes. Things on shorter timescales, perhaps, like El Nino or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, things that change both weather on land, but also in the water. This is a little more technical. This is sort of outside my sphere, but we also sample to meet National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, requirements. This is mostly sediment monitoring. My colleague Wendy is the primary contact for this work, but we are required to do some monitoring through our agreements with ecology to discharge into Puget Sound. But we are not actually required to do any of the water quality monitoring. That is an entirely voluntary activity that we do at the behest of the county powers that be. And then finally, one of the things that I focus on is assessing impacts of specific events on water quality. You might remember the West Point flooding event. I will show you some data from that event later, but collecting all of this data on a regular basis allows us to see whether there is actually a change in response to some of these specific events. And now I'm going to get into the how we do the monitoring. This is our spiffy research vessel. This is the RV Sound Guardian, which is a pun on the band Soundgarden. I think they were there at the christening of this vehicle, which occurred in 2016. It's a 48-foot aluminum catamaran, and it's very spiffy. I really like this boat, and if you're ever on the ship canal, just west of the Fremont Bridge, that is where our environmental lab is located, and you can see the Sound Guardian moored there. Note the big A-frame on the back of the boat. This is going to be important for the work that we do. Okay, how do we collect those samples off the Sound Guardian? So the first is through something called CTD profiles. This is a conductivity temperature depth profiler. That is what is circled in orange here. This whole instrument package is lowered off the boat by that A-frame, and it collects data in the water as it descends and as it ascends. So it's a big profile of water column data, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. It measures things other than conductivity, temperature, and depth too, things like oxygen, nitrogen, and chlorophyll fluorescence. You might be wondering, what is chlorophyll fluorescence and why do we care about it? It is a measure or a proxy of how many phytoplankton are in the water. The gist with this instrument is that it takes a little bit of water and it shines a light at it and it says, how green is this water? That greenness gives us a sense of how many phytoplankton are in the water. Oh, and I should say conductivity is how we measure salinity in the water, which is important because we are in an estuary. Puget Sound is the biggest estuary by volume in the contiguous 48, which is pretty cool. But we are interested in how the water from the Pacific Ocean plays nicely or not so nicely with the river water. So we keep track of salinity so we understand how much influence is coming from the ocean versus the rivers. This is an example of what a CTD profile, in this case of dissolved oxygen, so that is on the x-axis, dissolved oxygen down here, depth going from the surface all the way deep. This is at our Point Jefferson station, that sort of flagship station I was talking about earlier. The blue is a mean of all observations we have ever taken at Point Jefferson. There's a bit of variability in terms of the bottom depth, which is why you might notice that this full range here in the gray is a little bit narrower at the bottom just because there's fewer observations that have been taken quite that deep. And then the black line is one single cast of dissolved oxygen observations from October 2nd, 2023. I picked this date because the fall is when we tend to have the lowest dissolved oxygen concentrations in Puget Sound. The state water quality standard for this part of Puget Sound is 7 milligrams per liter, which is here. You might notice that all of the values measured on this particular day are below that 7 milligrams per liter line. Remember this, it is going to be important later. Okay, one other way that we measure water quality in Puget Sound is through bottle sampling. We can't have all of the information on these spiffy real-time continuous instruments. We can't get full profiles of everything we might like. So we also deploy something called Niskin bottles, which are, again, here circled in the orange. These take samples at specific depths, which we then bring back to our environmental lab located on the ship canal where the Sound Guardian is moored. And they're often more accurate than the values measured with the CTD. So we measure almost as many things as we want, depending on the volume of water collected. So we are able to measure all of the nutrients we care about, things like nitrate and nitrite, phosphate, silicate. I should say here that nitrate is the most prevalent form of what's called dissolved inorganic nitrogen in Puget Sound in most marine systems. This is the primary nutrient of concern, which I will get into more later, but you can think of when I say nitrogen, I mean nitrate. And again, we can measure chlorophyll in a more quantitative way than just shining a light at it and seeing how green it is. And we also measure something called phytoplankton, which is a breakdown product of chlorophyll. So when phytoplankton die, often you will measure phytoplankton instead of chlorophyll. This is a plot comparing a CTD plot, again from October. Oh, I guess this is from 2022. I thought it was 2023. All right, well, October 2022. Here we are looking at nitrate and nitrite combined, again, mostly nitrate, on the x-axis, depth again on the y-axis, going from shallow to deep. And you will see in orange, we've got some bottle samples. These are specific samples that were collected at the same time as the CTD cast and compared against the CTD profile from the nitrate and nitrite measuring sensor in the black. You might notice that they don't quite line up. That is expected. We trust the orange values more than the black values. And often what we will do is we will correct data from the CTD based on the bottle samples that we have taken of the same type of measurements. One of the cool things about this profile is it shows really clearly the change in nitrate over the full profile of the water column. You'll note that it is lowest at the surface, and it reaches a maximum sort of around 50 meters before leveling off to a pretty consistent depth throughout the rest of the profile. October is still considered part of the growing season for phytoplankton in Puget Sound, and phytoplankton slurp up this nitrate at the surface, which is why the values are a little bit lower than they are deeper. This consistent value throughout the rest of the water column mostly comes in from the Pacific Ocean. You can guess that this value of about 0.325 milligrams per liter nitrate nitrogen is about what's coming in from the Pacific Ocean, which is pretty cool. I'm going to show you a quick video of what it looks like to do some of this sample collection. This is a video from Fauntleroy Cove. We'll get to see some of my colleagues, Christopher on the left and Jim on the right, deploying the CTD. This is off of our older research vessel, so that's not quite as nice as the newer one, not quite as big. And here they are lowering the CTD and the Niskin rosette into the water, and we're going to get a little jump cut. Ooh, so bubbly. So now we're looking at the CTD being pulled up through the water column. Note how green it's getting, and keep an eye on those bottles. Something exciting is about to happen. Snap. So that will happen one more time, closer to the surface as we get out of the green and back into the more clear blue. Note all those particles floating around. So what happened there is the CTD was programmed from a cable connecting the CTD to the boat to snap those bottles shut at specific depths. One was snapped shut at 10 meters and the other was snapped shut closer to the surface. So now those two bottles are totally filled with water from those particular depths, and they will be taken back to the lab for analysis. What I really like about that video is just how green the water is. You'll also note that the water was not greenest at the surface. The water was greenest below the surface, which may seem kind of counterintuitive because phytoplankton are plants. You'd think they want the most light possible. But what actually ends up happening, there's enough choppiness at the surface of Puget Sound that they get mixed out of that surface layer, and they can really only hang out for a period of time below that, which is why the chlorophyll maximum, the greenest spot, tends to be a little bit below the surface, somewhere between 5 and 15 meters most of the time. Cool. Okay, the final piece of our measurements are moorings. I've replaced one of the symbols with smiley faces. These are the moorings. We have 4 of them in Central Puget Sound, and these are really special places because they are able to collect continuous data. So instead of going out once or twice a month to take samples, these are out there 24/7. They are sampling mostly at a single depth every 15 minutes. All of this data is online, and if you Google King County marine moorings, you will see data from all of these moorings in near real time, which is pretty sweet. Having these moorings out there help us understand the Puget Sound on a finer grain time scale. We are also able to see things that happen at night because we do not go out on the boat at night. You might imagine that things like phytoplankton, which are photosynthesizing during the day, act quite differently at night, and you see different things in the water quality data, which is true. You can see all sorts of changes, which I will show you in the data, at least a little snippet here in a second. This is our Point Williams buoy. This is moored near the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal, which I think you can see the ferry in the background. What a lovely shot. So this big yellow buoy is floating out there. It's anchored at the bottom. I think we put out a video not too long ago about this buoy. If you Google Big Yellow Buoy, King County, you will see me talking about this buoy even more if you're not too bored of my voice by the end of this talk. It looks so idyllic. However, there's some problems that occur when you're deploying instruments out in saltwater, productive saltwater with lots of organisms, not us organisms, growing there. And here is an example of what one of those instruments might look like on the right after being out there for only 3 months. That is a lot of what we call biofouling. We get all sorts of different types of biofouling depending on where the moorings are located. This one is not too bad, really. It's mostly just seaweed. However, we get some things called caprellids on several of the instruments. They're little shrimp, you might say, ghost shrimp, and they look crunchy and creepy and crawly, and they cover the whole instruments. I spared you the video that I have of the caprellids covering the instrument, but if you are curious, I recommend you Google those as well. We get all sorts of funky things happening. All these systems have water intakes. Sometimes they suck up things like jellyfish, small jellyfish, and other things that really mess with the data. One of the moorings near the Seattle Aquarium has a little solitary tunicate. It's this little globby thing that really likes the Teflon junction on our pH sensors, and it just hangs out there sometimes. We'll see the pH go woo, and we go, oh, well, I guess it's time to remove our little friend. One of the benefits to having continuous data that's reporting in real time is that we can see when the data go sideways. It is a full-time job to keep this data looking good. So that is mostly done by my colleague Greg. He keeps an eye on all the mooring data and sees when things are going a little sideways. Here's an example of some data from the inner Quartermaster Harbor mooring. So remember that spot all the way inside Quartermaster Harbor, nestled up against Vashon Island. This is looking at dissolved oxygen on the y-axis and about a week of data from 2023 on the x-axis. Note that there are a lot of data points just within this single week. For this single parameter, oxygen, there's a lot of things happening. The values here, you might notice, get pretty low. They get pretty close to 0 milligrams per liter oxygen. We might call that hypoxic. This is not unusual for Quartermaster Harbor for it to have periods of hypoxia during the late summer and early fall. But one of the cool things is that it changes a lot. It doesn't stay hypoxic. So we've got respiration at night drawing oxygen down. So that's when things like phytoplankton are not able to photosynthesize and things are respiring just like we do, taking in oxygen and spitting out carbon dioxide. So things are respiring at night, leading to decreases in dissolved oxygen. And there is photosynthesis happening during the day, causing the dissolved oxygen to rebound back up. So the oxygen can go from near zero back to super saturated within a single day. And I wish I had a video of this, but I have anecdotal evidence that bubbles of oxygen have been observed at this site. When things get super, super saturated, you've got bubbles of oxygen at the surface. So it's a pretty dynamic and cool ecosystem here in Quartermaster Harbor. One other thing that the moorings capture that we're not always able to with our twice-a-month sampling are discrete events, like in this case, the tsunami that happened off the coast of Japan in 2011. This is data from another one of our moorings, Stockton, which is in outer Quartermaster Harbor. What you're looking at here is depth on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. Usually the depth profiles at Stockton mimic tide oscillations pretty regularly. So that's what you're looking at here. These are essentially just capturing the tides of Puget Sound, our semi-diurnal tides. But you might notice that things start to get a little funky right about here. These lines don't look as clean anymore. They're pretty wiggly. That is extra water from the tsunami that has sloshed into Puget Sound from Japan, and now it is wiggling around, causing these aberrations from the tidal cycle. This is the sort of stuff that we can capture with the moorings, and it's part of the reason that it's so important, not in this case, because nothing is really going to go sideways from this tsunami water. But sometimes when things happen, like when the pier next to the Seattle Aquarium collapsed a few years ago, we were able to see what changed in the water after that collapse. And the answer was absolutely nothing, which was pretty reassuring, I suppose, that we didn't see a lot of changes, which is why I didn't show the data here, because it was really quite boring, which is great. We'll have to see some boring data in response to traumatic events. Okay, now speaking of trauma, let's talk about multi-year trends. Actually, I won't get into the trauma right away. Here we're looking at some temperature anomaly data. So a temperature anomaly in this case is a monthly temperature at the surface of Point Jefferson. This is that flagship site. 0 to 5 meters is just the top 5 meters of the water column. We would call that the surface. We are comparing a monthly value at the surface to a baseline average of temperature. The baseline in this case is 1998 to 2013, which stops before the marine heat wave, which you can see really clearly in this figure. We are comparing these anomaly values. So blue values are negative anomalies, so cooler than average. Red values, higher than average. You might notice there's a big blob of red here. You might remember in 2014 to 2016, there was a blob off the Pacific coast, and that corresponded with a marine heat wave. And we saw that marine heat wave really, really clearly in our data. In this case, temperature obviously affected by the marine heat wave, but we also saw some changes in our other parameters that we measured as well. The other things shown on this diagram are two climate indices. ENSO, E-N-S-O, stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. So that's the El Nino La Nina change that we get from year to year here in Puget Sound. Right now, we are at the tail end of an El Nino. We're heading back into neutral and soon La Nina conditions. We had 3 La Nina winters in a row, and we're probably going to have another one again. So, and then that's the dashed line. The solid line is PDO, which stands for Pacific Decadal Oscillation. So this is a bit of a longer term change, or it has a slower period compared to El Nino. But both correlate with each other pretty well. And they also correlate pretty well to these temperature anomaly changes. So we've got positive ENSO and PDO indices corresponding with that marine heat wave, negative PDO and ENSO anomalies corresponding with these negative temperature anomalies. And this is a relatively short time frame of data, but this is consistent with what others have observed in even longer term data sets in Puget Sound, that we see quite an impact, particularly in temperature, that correlates with these other Pacific weather patterns. Now to get into some more specifics about how temperature is changing over time. This is now looking at deeper data from Point Jefferson, temperature on the y-axis, and all of the data that we have from 1998 through 2024. It looks kind of a mess. You get a lot of intra-year variability. So if I were to draw a line between all these plots, it would just go up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down, because it's hot in the summer and cold in the winter, which is totally groundbreaking. The line here is what we call a smoothed fit. So this is just a low S smooth applied to this data, and you can see it's got a bit of a hitch in it here. This hitch corresponds, cleverly enough, with the marine heat wave. It was hot during those years, and it was particularly hot. These values at the bottom are mostly winter values. The summer values are not that out of line compared with previous and subsequent observations, which is alarming in of itself that our summer water is getting hotter. But the winter water in particular was very, very hot during the marine heat wave. And you might wonder, you see this wiggly line and you see all these data points and you say, what does this really mean in terms of how things are changing? Well, it really depends on what time frame you're looking at. If you look at this time frame right around the marine heat wave, you might say, oh, well, it's increasing a lot. It's increasing about 1 degree centigrade per decade, which is about 5 times the predicted global change in water temperature. However, if you look at a longer time period, in this case from 1998 through 2018, I think, this is a time frame that corresponds with a report we just put out. So if you want to learn more about this, you are welcome to read all 600 pages that we wrote about this time period. But the change is much more in line with what is observed globally, which is about 0.2 degrees centigrade per decade. So yay, Puget Sound is getting hotter just as fast as everywhere else. I'll let that sink in for a minute. Anyway, but some things haven't changed, which is great. Or not great. This is an organism called Noctiluca, a photograph at the top taken by my colleague Gabriella. We have seen Noctiluca blooms in Puget Sound for a long time. You have probably seen photos of them. So they're sometimes called tomato soup blooms. They are really thick and red, and they look like a nice tomato bisque. On the left is a photo from 1975, and on the right is a photo from 2018. We have been seeing these blooms for a long time. And one of the warnings that I often have to think of, and I remind colleagues and others who work in Puget Sound, is that sometimes things change over time, but sometimes just our ability to see things has also changed over time. So our monitoring now for things like Noctiluca has changed a lot compared to 1975 and even before that. So we have to be careful when we're talking about changes over time to caveat what we are able to say versus what we are assuming because we're less sure about what was happening in the past. A perfect example of this is nitrogen. So again, this is at Point Jefferson. This is a sort of average of all the different depths from 1998 through 2024. Nitrogen on the y-axis here. Whoops, there goes my pointer. And again, fitted with that sort of smoothed curve. You might say, well, is it changing? I don't know. It's kind of wiggly. It goes up and it goes down. And this is pretty consistent with what has been observed with other groups around the state, is that in recent decades, there's been a bit of a sinusoidal change in nitrogen. If we extend this record further back by adding some data that Eugene Coleus collected in Puget Sound in all the way sometimes back to the 30s, but in this case with nitrogen, just back to the 60s, we can see that nitrogen is changing. There is a significant change. The p-value for this is about 10 to the minus 4, so pretty significant. And it's changing by about 0.008 milligrams per liter per decade. So that black line you see here is for a seasonal Mann-Kendall analysis. That is just a way that we measure changes in time in a different way compared to a linear regression fit, which is shown in the blue with a bit of error bar around the gray. Note that the error, of course, greater in the past because there are simply fewer measurements. We've got a lot more measurements in modern times. So we can say with some certainty that nitrogen is changing over time. Which leads me to sort of what I do in my day-to-day now, which is thinking about nutrients, thinking about nitrogen. I'm going to start off with something that you are all probably pretty familiar with, which is the West Point failure. A flooding event due to power loss caused 2 untreated discharge events at the emergency bypass outfall sometime in February 2017. The issues at the treatment plant continued for about 3 months before it was fully resolved. And one of the things that we're able to see with our data, because we've been collecting data since before 2017, is what changes did we see during this time. So this map here, where all the big red circles are, those are fecal coliforms, which I alluded to briefly earlier. So this is a indicator of where we're seeing untreated sewage. Lots of untreated sewage, my goodness. But that's not a surprise. This is right at the emergency bypass outfall. So lots of untreated sewage. This is from right after the flooding event, so February 9th. And then a couple of days later, February 12th, much fewer fecal coliforms, which is great to see. So just to give you a sense of how quickly things dissipate through Puget Sound, those fecal coliforms did not stick around. They were washed away by the currents. But for me, what I really care about is what kind of nitrogen signals came out during this event. So the event is marked on the bottom there by that orange arrow. 2017 data is shown in the orange triangles, and the data from before then is shown in the gray circles. In this case, we're looking at total nitrogen on the y-axis, so it's a little bit different from just the nitrate. It's also including things like organic nitrogen, ammonia, but mostly, again, nitrate. Even in wastewater, nitrate is the thing. So you might say, well, does 2017 look different from the other years? We were reassured to see that it was not actually that different. So this data was collected at a cleverly named KSSK02. All of our stations were named off of this map that no one can find anymore. So it's just some grid system that no one fully understands, but they're relatively alphabetical from north to south. So this one is close-ish to Carkeek Park, and the 55-meter depth is roughly the trapping depth for the outfall plume of West Point. So we didn't really see any changes. And when we ran a t-test comparing 2017 to the other years, we did not see a significant difference between 2017 and 2010 to 2016, which was really great. But why do we care about what kind of nitrogen came out? So in Puget Sound and most other marine ecosystems, nitrogen is considered to be the limiting nutrient. So phytoplankton growing happily until all the nitrogen is gone. When you add more nitrogen to the system, there's more growth, which leads to more phytoplankton. And when phytoplankton die, they decompose. This decomposition process decreases the oxygen. This is just a very generic model for what's called eutrophication in marine ecosystems. It doesn't always happen exactly like this, but generally speaking, when we have more nitrogen, we have less oxygen. Less oxygen is not great. That is bad for fish. That is bad for things that live in the bottom of the water where oxygen tends to be lowest, and that is what is regulated by the State Department of Ecology as they are deputized by the Clean Water Act. So everyone cares about what kind of oxygen conditions are happening in Puget Sound. The bulk of the nitrogen in Puget Sound comes from the Pacific Ocean, which is shown here in this big blue box. Somewhere between 88 and 95% of nitrogen comes from Puget Sound. But the rest comes from us, mostly from different land-based sources, which are broken down on the right-hand side here. Mostly wastewater treatment plants, but also some inputs from the watersheds in the green and purple. So King County, being a wastewater discharger, needs to keep track of what sort of impacts are happening from the nitrogen that is coming from wastewater, mostly nitrogen in urine, which I learned when I started this job. I assumed it was mostly coming from fecal material, but that is not true. It's like 80% of it is from urine. So I guess if you don't want to contribute to this nitrogen in wastewater, pee on your azaleas. TBD. Not sure that's a great idea, but if you're concerned about wastewater, that is pretty much the only thing that you can do. So how do we quantify those wastewater impacts? Well, it's really hard. Those nitrate and dissolved oxygen signatures we measure in the water are what we would refer to as an integrated signal. We can't really tell what's happening to them in situ. So we need a model. Models can tell us what kind of impacts these nitrogen discharges are expected to have in the environment. And here I am showing the model grid for the Salish Sea model, which is developed by the Pacific Northwest National Lab and mainly deployed by the Department of Ecology to determine compliance with the Clean Water Act. The areas in red, so mostly up here in Woodby, oh, where's my pointer? There it is. Whoa. Okay, up here in Woodby, we've got some red spots. We've got some in Port Susan here by Camino, and down in South Sound, and also at the end of Hood Canal. So what's being shown here is dissolved oxygen non-compliance. These are the areas that, oh, my cursor won't go away. Okay, well, we'll just have to deal with it. These are areas where human nitrogen impacts are predicted to change dissolved oxygen the most. How do we measure that with a model? Or how do we estimate that with a model, I should say? How do we use that in a regulatory context? Well, we can run the model and just take all the human stuff away. We have pretty good data about what's coming out of the wastewater treatment plants, and we have some estimates about what are coming out of the rivers. So we can just remove them from the model and run the model for pre-human conditions. And then we can subtract current conditions from the pre-human conditions and give us the estimate of oxygen depletion due to human sources, which can be then evaluated against the water quality criteria for Puget Sound. So we compare numbers and then we say, okay, if it's below those numbers, remember that 7 milligrams per liter earlier, all of those data points were below 7, so they're out of compliance with that numeric criteria. But then we take it one step further and say, how much oxygen depletion was due to human sources? And in those areas in central Puget Sound where we're monitoring, the difference is less than 0.2 milligrams per liter. But in those other places, those red areas on the map, the difference is greater. And this criteria is currently under revision at Ecology. It got thrown out by EPA a couple of years ago, but it's being rewritten to be pretty much the same thing. Happy to talk about that more if people are curious about how this is being implemented. Which leads us to a series of questions. If we have all these places that are out of compliance with water quality standards, how can we fix it? How can we most effectively spend money to mitigate these issues? And boy, are some of the fixes really expensive, which have interesting and, again, expensive implications for taxpayers in King County and elsewhere. Then we wonder, are these nutrient changes and other conditions contributing to changes in higher trophic levels? So things like fish and orca, biological endpoints that we all care deeply about. Because we can say we're out of compliance with the water quality standards as much as we want, but what does that really mean in practice in terms of impacts on organisms, non-us organisms? And then finally, can we support the Washington water quality standards with better data and better models? Because all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And we can make models more useful by providing them with data, which I will talk about a little bit later. So what are we doing? What are we doing about nutrients? Well, the first thing is we're thinking about nutrient trading. So these are current efforts that are mostly being undertaken by the Department of Ecology, but also King County and others. And currently they are hypothetical because they would be illegal under the current framework of our water quality standards. But it could allow us to spend money more efficiently and allow us to be more effective faster at eliminating some of these dissolved oxygen non-compliances and being fully up to code in terms of this nutrient permit that is coming down the pipeline in the next few years. One other thing that we are working on right now is doing some of that higher trophic level research. So really figuring out what are the oxygen thresholds that species care about, specifically Puget Sound species. There's been a lot of work done in other places, but very little work done in Puget Sound to figure out what exactly fish care about here. And we can use something called the metabolic index to estimate what exactly those oxygen thresholds, combined with temperature changes from things like global warming, how those things combine to compress habitat. So the figure on the right is from Southern California. It is a map of the Southern California coast, looking at percent change in habitat thickness. Red means a decrease in habitat thickness. Blue means habitat expansion. You can see there's a little bit of variability here, but we are working to do similar things in Puget Sound to figure out where habitat is being compressed and where it is not, so that we can focus our efforts to try to mitigate dissolved oxygen and potentially temperature issues in places where fish habitat is being most compressed. And then finally, this is where most of my work comes in, is working on a multi-model approach. So I talked about Salish Sea model really briefly, but there are two other models in Puget Sound that can be used all together to give us the best estimate of what is actually happening and what is having an impact in Puget Sound. Again, all models are wrong. They're all wrong in slightly different ways. So by having the most models, you can have the best estimate of what is changing. The model on the left is the Salish Seacast, which is run out of the University of British Columbia. And on the right is the Live Ocean model from UW. I highly recommend you Google Live Ocean. The website is super cool and has all these nifty little features. You can track where particles go in Puget Sound. You can click on a spot and say, where has this particle gone? It shows you a big squiggle of all the surface currents. It's really neat. That one is primarily a forecasting model. For the next few days, it will tell you what's going to happen in Puget Sound, which is pretty cool. But the gist is that all of these models are developed for slightly different reasons. And so they have their different pros and cons in terms of how they handle things like the physical movement of water, but also the biogeochemistry that controls how nutrients and dissolved oxygen change over time. And what do all models really need in order to be the best models they can be? They need data. And that is where I come in. The thing that I am doing mostly at work is compiling all of our data and sending it to modelers so that they can improve their models of Puget Sound, which seems really convoluted, but it is really, really important for these models to be grounded in actual data and observations, because otherwise you could just say, yes, this model shows temperature is this, and you say, okay, great, but is it actually that? And that is why we need data for the models. So to sum up, these are some final thoughts, which is Puget Sound is really lovely. I showed you a bunch of pretty photos and videos, and I love Puget Sound. And I think it is really important, the work that we do to support this beautiful and complex ecosystem to help us best understand how things are changing and how they will continue to change over time. And then finally, we need as much long-term location-specific data as we can to make well-informed, impactful policy decisions to ensure that the money that we are spending and the time we are spending doing it is actually going to make a difference in the environment. And that's it. Oh, this slide says no notes. Great, no notes. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Questions for Dr. Martin.
You're concerned about the P, right?
Somewhat. I would say if I had to pick a thing to be concerned about in Puget Sound, it's not actually wastewater, it's stormwater. Because that is being measured even less. We don't actually know how much of anything is going into Puget Sound from stormwater compared to wastewater. So wastewater is sort of the beast that we know because we measure it, and that's great. It's the dial that we can turn the easiest compared to things like stormwater. But stormwater scares me a lot more than pee.
How does the increasing temperature in Puget Sound affect how the water circulates and how fast?
Ooh, that's a great question. So there's a couple things that temperature is impacting in addition to circulation, which I will also touch on. One is dissolved oxygen solubility. So as the temperature goes up, dissolved oxygen goes down. So the bulk of changes that we've seen in dissolved oxygen over time can actually be explained by change in temperature. Changes in temperature also impact things like stratification, in addition to river flow and other things that impact how much salty hot water is at the top versus salty colder water deeper. So we expect residence time, generally speaking, in Puget Sound to increase, especially in terminal inlets like those in South Sound and Hood Canal. But that's not, it's a little fuzzy. The trend is less clear. There's quite a bit of year-to-year variability in terms of how quickly water circulates. So I can't be certain that it's going to be really changing, but there is expected to be some change due to the temperature. But mostly, actually, it's rivers. Changes in how much precipitation we're getting, which changes how often and how much volume is coming out of the rivers, has the biggest impact on things like exchange flow.
I wondered if you would like to comment on any effect of microplastics.
Ooh. Outside my purview.
Outside your purview.
But they
okay.
freak me out a lot. I will say the fact that we're finding them everywhere. This is a emerging area of research for our group in particular. There is another subgroup within the science and technical support section at King County who works mostly on contaminants of emerging concern and also now microplastics. So we're hoping to amp up our monitoring of microplastics. But one of the things that I think about, as someone who doesn't study them, is just how I can reduce my own plastic intake and thus plastic disposal that is required after you use the plastics. So I'm hoping to invest in something like a water filter for my washing machine, which I think where the bulk of my microplastic contributions would come in. And there's a whole bunch of other things that people, generally speaking, can do, which is just mostly reduce your plastic use, period. But I would say it's not really clear what the current impact is in Puget Sound.
Dr. Martin, where are the water intakes for the drinking water in King County located? And by the time we drink that water, are they free of most of these cruddy little things?
Yes, mostly from the Cedar River watershed, which is very nice, clean, lovely drinking water. So you can rest assured that our drinking water is very clean and very safe to drink, unlike other places. Seattle has the best drinking water, period.
Could you say a little bit more about what happens with this data that you collect? Who does it go to, and what happens in response to it?
Yeah, totally. So there are a couple of different places that the data go. First and foremost, the data just go online. Anyone can download any of our data, and if it's something is not there that you want to see, you can email me and I'll send it to you. So that's one place, is we just put it out publicly. The data is also sent directly to all the groups that are using it in models. So every time they run a new year of the model, they compare the output from the model to all of the data that we and other groups who are doing monitoring Puget Sound send to them. So that's another place that it goes. And the third place it goes is into Ecology's EIM. I forget what that stands for, but I think it's Environmental Inventory something or another. They've got a big database online. So it also goes into the EIM database, which is used in tandem with the models to make some of the regulatory compliance assessments of whether things are in or out of compliance with the water quality standards. So the data is also being used in that way. And then the fourth, I guess I should include, is we publish papers and reports just kind of detailing what we generally see in the data. Also used by other people to do that too, like groups at UW who use our data.
Gordon has a daughter at UBC, just retired, but she teaches, I think, exactly what you would have studied in school. Do you have any interface with UBC on all of this?
Yeah, so we do work with Susan Allen's group at UBC, the group that puts together the Salish Sea cast. So one of the many models that, they're based in Canada, so they care mostly about Canadian waters, but they also, the scope of their model extends down into Puget Sound. So that's the bulk of our contact with UBC is through this group, providing them data and working with them to improve their model, particularly when it comes to dissolved oxygen and nitrogen inputs from the U.S., because that is something that they have not included up until a couple of years ago.
Any other questions? Well, Dr. Martin, thank you so much, and please thank the doctor for her presentation this morning.
Thanks, everybody.